Hello, welcome to Dialogue. I'm Pando in Beijing. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has just wrapped up his visit to Brunei, Cambodia and Laos, with China reaching a 4-point consensus with these 3 ASEAN member countries over the South China Sea issue. As a ruling on the case filed by Manila before the International Tribunal of Arbitration on its dispute with Beijing is to be expected within just a few weeks. What significance does the consensus have for the dispute settlement? What historical evidence does China have to support its sovereignty in the sea anyway? And how should we understand the role of the United States here? To answer those questions and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Mr. Xue Li from the Institute of World Economics and Politics at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences and Mr. Ran Zongze, Vice President of the China Institute of International Studies. But before we get started, let's take a look at this background report.
The South China Sea is a key issue on Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's agenda, and discussions resulted in a 4-point consensus between China and the 3 ASEAN nations Brunei, Cambodia and Laos. The consensus says all countries believe that the dispute over some reefs near Nansha Islands is not an issue between China and ASEAN and should not affect their relations. All parties should respect the right of involved countries to choose their own means of settling disputes. Unilateral imposition by other countries should not be tolerated. All agree to uphold the 4th clause of the Declaration on the Code of Conduct on the South China Sea. This posits that territorial and maritime rights and interests should be resolved by dialogue between directly related countries. And finally, all believe China and ASEAN countries are capable of maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea region through cooperation. Countries outside the region should play a constructive role. While in Laos, Wang Yi met with President Bumhan Vorachit and Foreign Minister Thonglang Sisulith with a focus on boosting bilateral ties. Wang Yi said China will help Laos with its industrialization process and ensure that the China-Laos Railway is constructed ahead of time. Laos holds the rotating chair of ASEAN this year, and Wang also pledged to elevate the China-ASEAN ties to a new high. Laos' foreign minister says his country appreciates China's help and that it's willing to expand cooperation with China to benefit the people in the region.
So let's talk about the South China Sea, a regional issue that also attracts a lot of international attention, if not concern. Gentlemen, let's start with this 4-point consensus reached between China and 3 ASEAN member countries. We know Laos is the chair of ASEAN this year, and Brunei is a claimant in the South China Sea, and Cambodia has long been known for its neutral stance in issues like this. So how significant is this consensus, Mr. Ran?
Well, it's pretty much significant and very also timely, as you just rightly put it out, that Brunei is one of the claimants of the South China Sea. However, Brunei reached agreement with Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign ministers, and the Chinese side that any rows or disputes must be solved according to the dual-track approach. Basically means that direct parties involved through negotiation and talk to address the disputes, and at the same time, and the stability of South China Sea must be maintained through the cooperation between China and ASEAN. And now, yes, this year it currently serving as a rotating chair of the ASEAN, so it is very much important to play a part in chairing, steering the future meetings and lots of events which will coming up later on. And of course, Cambodia has been very consistent. It insists that any kind of disputes between China and some of the ASEAN members should not affect China-ASEAN relationship as a whole, because certainly the row and the disputes is not the problem between China and ASEAN as a whole. So I think the 3 countries, their agreement with the Chinese position on the South China Sea, how to handle it, actually is the answer, and as it's a rebuke to the approach and the ways hosted by, for example, Philippines and to some extent by American.
So we'll get to China's dual-track proposal in a minute. Mr. Xue, what's your take on the significance of this consensus?
I think that also implied for all those ASEAN members, they have their own stance on how to deal with the South China Sea issues and how to make the stability and peace in this area. It's not in accordance with the Philippines or something else. I think that one will make sense.
So after meeting with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, Cambodia's Foreign Minister has reiterated his country's neutral stance on the issue, and he said, I'm quoting, "The stance of Cambodia has always been to appeal to all sides involved to make efforts to solve the dispute through peaceful means. If all countries respected these principles like Cambodia, we should not have problems." Does he suggest that some countries are actually making counterproductive measures to a peaceful solution, Mr. Ran?
Well, as a matter of fact, a couple of years ago when Cambodia serves as the rotating chair of ASEAN at Foreign Ministers meeting of ASEAN, some countries, particularly like, for example, the Philippines and also Vietnam, they want to hijack the ASEAN for their own purpose. Let me put it this way: they have bilateral disputes with China on some of the issues on South China Sea. So they want to translate into a whole disagreement between China and ASEAN. So Cambodia holds that because Cambodia is not a claimant and not directly involved, and along with a couple of other ASEAN members. So what's the point to get themselves involved in such a very thorny issue? So Cambodia has been very consistent in trying to argue those issues must be addressed or must be resolved through the parties, countries directly concerned, and also they oppose any kind of unilateral actions taken by parties concerned to complicate the issue. Because back in 2002, China and ASEAN reached agreement on DOC. According to the Article 4 of the DOC, any kind of disagreement or dispute between China and ASEAN member states must be resolved on the bilateral basis through cooperation and consultation.
So, Mr. Xue, what do you think the Cambodian Foreign Minister is suggesting?
He's suggesting that the case, this one, the disputes in the South China Sea is to be solved by the direct negotiation will be much better than go to the tribunal or something like that. And I think that the Philippines go that way just partially because of its history, because he was westernized more than other countries. But for most of the countries in this area, I would prefer to go to the ASEAN way, which will make all parties concerned more ease, and also will put forward the resolve of the problem based on the consensus, which will be much better.
We'll talk about Philippines very soon, but now let's get a clear understanding on China's stance. We know China has been advocating this drill track proposal in dealing with the South China Sea, which means negotiating a peaceful solution while maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea by China and ASEAN. So, and the Foreign Minister Wang Yi called it the most practical and feasible way to properly solve the South China Sea issue. Why is that?
Well, absolutely, it's crystal clear. And from the historical trajectory and also the current status, I can give you an example. For example, back in 2004, China conducted a bilateral talk with Vietnam. We sealed agreement on the, for example, on the demarcation and also the fishery cooperation in Beibu Bay, which is the first ever such kind of legal document reached between China and Vietnam on such a very critical issue on the maritime border. So in the past, we already achieved through the bilateral agreement, through bilateral consultation and a talk. That was a pretty good example. And furthermore, China has successfully addressed or resolved the land border issue with 12 countries out of 14. So we accumulate enormous experience. I've been doing that. And now, of course, and the current status, it is also very useful to think. And you know, because each cases are very different, so you need the parties directly concerned to address the issue. That, if you look at the worldwide, most of the border has been addressed through such kind of bilateral talk. Of course, there are other ways, but most of them has been successful the practice. So China has been trying to argue this dual track approach. Actually, this dual track first initiated by Brunei. This is why Foreign Minister Wang Yi had a very good talk with Brunei, and Brunei is one of the claimants of the South China Sea. So the two sides reach a very critical agreement on this. So that is pretty significant.
So you think that could be an example in dealing with the South China Sea issue?
Yeah, absolutely. And then from the history, and also, look, let me give you an opposite example. And now currently Philippines filed the so-called arbitration, which is not the way, not the proper way to address the disputes and differences. However, it just complicated the issue, and it also involved many others external powers. So that is not the way. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned, China has reached a historical agreement even with Vietnam years ago about the maritime and border. That was the example, tiny example of how bilateral consultation talk work.
So, gentlemen, I noticed that you used the word bilateral a lot during our discussion on the relations between China and ASEAN. But we know that ASEAN is a multilateral framework. So, how do you view the coordination or even political wrangling within this bloc on the South China Sea issue? Or let's put it in a simple way: is it pro-China, neutral, or in a bad scenario, Mr. Xue?
Yes, but for those countries, they have the different opinion. That's quite natural. But we also notice the fact that for most of the disputes with regard to the marine issues is resolved by the direct negotiation rather than go to the third part, like international court. And also, most of the countries, like the Malaysia, like the Indonesia, and not to speak of the countries like Laos and the Cambodia, they don't support to solve the problem by that way, but only a few countries they prefer to do this. But that one will not be a constructive way to solve the problem or to reduce the tension in this area.
Well, Mr. Ran, what's your take?
Well, you're absolutely right. ASEAN as a whole is formulated as a multilateral organization institution. However, concerning with the South China Sea, there are two groups basically. One is a claimant, the other is a non-claimant. The claimants, including, for example, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei, and the others, they are non-claimants. So let me put it this way: most of the ASEAN members are non-claimants on these issues. So it is the challenge job actually here is how to make sure that issues can be peacefully and smoothly addressed. And the way like the Philippines has been conducted in the recent years is create counterproductive. That creates the division of the unity of the ASEAN. For example, back again, I use the case when Cambodia was serving the chair of the ASEAN members a couple of years ago, and the Philippines they want to exert this South China Sea issue into the joint communique. And many other, or most of the other countries, they are non-claimant of this. So why should they just sign on or endorse your position on that?
So do you think actually the Philippines is doing the same thing right now, trying to assert its influence into the ASEAN coordination? Because I noticed that Philippine Foreign Secretary just visited Laos on April the 20th, almost in sync with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi.
Well, it's quite obvious because Laos serving the rotating presidency, so it is, I think, one of the reasons why the foreign ministers of the Philippines they pay a visit to that. They want to exert their influence and to lobby or to make sure that he got a sort of a favorable deal or whatsoever. But the point is, the more the Philippines has exerted itself in unilaterals, its a private interest into the ASEAN, it will create more division of the ASEAN member states. It will certainly undermine the unity of ASEAN because many other members that feel unnecessary or hesitate to sign on the Philippines position.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your input. We'll continue this discussion very soon. You're watching Dialogue on CCTV News. Stay with us. You're watching Dialogue on CCTV News. We now continue our discussion on the South China Sea issue. So, gentlemen, let's talk more about this so-called arbitration case brought forward by the Philippines. The results will be expected in a few weeks' time. Now, let's trace back the whole process a little bit. And during the concluding remarks to the tribunal in The Hague last December, then Philippine Foreign Secretary Albert Del Rosario said that his country views China as a valued friend and believes this arbitration benefits everyone. You may all doubt that. And then the gloves were off, and he went on to say that for the Philippines it will clarify what is theirs, specifically fishing rights, rights to resources and rights to enforce laws within their exclusive economic zone. What do you make of those remarks, Mr. Ray?
Well, as a matter of fact, if we look at the whole so-called tribunal case, that was a farce. And as a matter of fact, back in 2013, the Philippines unilaterally initiated the arbitration tribunal against China in the South China Sea. It violates a couple of principles and agreements. For example, first it violates the agreement between Chinese government and the Philippine government. We reached years ago before that the two sides agreed to handle those disputes through bilateral consultation and a talk. Secondly, it violates the DOC. Back in 2002, China and ASEAN signed the DOC. The Article 4 of the DOC committed that the parties concerned should address their problem through bilateral talk. And then, of course, such kind of unilateral actions only create the things. Of course, for Philippines, of course, there's one more thing, maybe make it more complicated, because it is certainly some other external power. For example, America is also surely behind this kind of file. So it is not a point to address the issue. However, it will create more problematic issues.
Well, what's your take, Mr. Xue? Some are actually arguing that the Philippines is trying to seek arbitration for a pseudo case because the tribunal is for maritime issues, but actually this is a territorial dispute. What's your take?
Generally speaking, I would say that it's not the pure judicial case, it's a political case. It should be resolved by the negotiation between the elected parts. If you take a stubborn attitude to go to the court, which will make things complicated.
And, excuse me, we know that China has reiterated that it will not take part in this arbitration, and indeed it will not accept the results. So what's the legal basis for China to do so, Mr. Ray?
Well, absolutely. And I heard a lot of some Philippines and others on Western media that say, well, China is fear of losing, fear of they have the weak argument, so they don't participate. However, if you look at the fact, exactly China has been exercising its rights under the article of 298 of the UNCLOS, because in this article, a sovereign country you can make a declaration. China did a declaration in 2006 that excludes any kind of compulsory arbitration. And similar declaration has been made by over 30 countries. So they're not going to participate. So this is exactly the case. China played by the rule, and we exercise our right. And this is the first point. The second point, I think, China as a sovereign country, we have our sovereign rights to choose what is the proper way to address any kind of disputes and the differences. These rights must be respected. And this is also one of the point of consensus reached between China and Cambodia, Brunei, and Laos.
What's your take, Mr. Xue, from a legal point of view?
I have a little bit different opinion with Dr. Wang, because according to the Article 2098, different countries have a different interpretation of the articles. For some countries, they use it for the arbitration case, and some use it for not to step in. Because that's one, both are quite equal or legal. We should notice the fact that totally around 30 countries, they make the statement to exclude, to accept such kinds of the case, and the others, they accept it. And that's the first one. And the second one, it's not the each countries they have their own base or their explanation for their stance. But this one, generally speaking, go to court or not go to court, that's a controversial. There's no universal judgment.
Well, it looks like there's a lot of international legal technicalities here, but let's talk about a possible result. How will the result, whatever it is, influence China or affect China in any substantial way, Mr. Wen?
I don't think so. I don't think it will affect whatever the outcome.
So how will China react to the result if it's against China?
We will say it is pretty a little premature because we have to wait for the outcome, and now there's a lot of speculations about it. So we will see what it really comes out. Of course, China. First of all, I don't think it will have any significant impact on the status quo, on the Chinese position on South China Sea. As I said, we exercise our rights to choose the way of resolving the dispute. So we strongly disagree with the way the Philippines has conducted. Secondly, I think this arbitration, I don't know what I could do the prejudgment of that. However, according to some media reports, which is not that kind of favorable to China, I guess. I don't know exactly. However, the point is that China, we of course were ready to see, and we have our own ways and approaches, and that does not mean China will change its mind on this arbitration in the future. No, not at all. Well, our policy is crystal clear. We're not going to engage, not to accept, and not to participate any kind of this proceeding. We're not going to be part of it.
So what do you think is the real intention of the Philippines to file this so-called arbitration case, since it will not affect China in a substantial way?
Let me tell you what is the real intention of this. Why the Philippines, why do they so stubbornly engage in such kind of arbitration? The fact is that they want to use this arbitration to, let's say, to hide or to, let's say, whitewash what they illegally occupy the Chinese territory. You know, the Philippines in the 1970s, through 4 military actions, overtook China's territory in the South China Sea. And now they illegally occupy 8 of them. So this is a fact. So they want to use this arbitration, maybe manipulate as a sort of a whitewash for their illegal occupation of Chinese territory. So this will not, any kind of arbitration will not going to change the fact that the Philippines still occupy Chinese territory in the South China Sea. It will not going to change this fact.
Mr. Xu, what's your take on Philippines' real intention?
I can understand why the Philippines got that way, but I would like to say
why. You say you can understand why?
Because they say they are entitled to do this. Because the international law is not quite clear. Sometimes quite ambiguous. So different countries use it in different ways. That's why.
But don't you think national interest on natural resources and territory takes a larger part?
Yes. Because especially for the land in disputes, they have the different meanings for the different countries. Of course, that's right. But before the disputes were settled down, every country deal with it in a peaceful way will be much better for both sides, and not go to that way. I don't say in the Philippines.
But this certainly makes the situation more complicated.
Yes, that's the point. So I suggest Philippines better go back to the negotiation table. That will be much better for the future of the disputes.
So, Mr. Ran, why do you think the Philippines is so eagerly to bring forward this case? Do you think actually it's been manipulated, since you used the word fast? Who's behind it?
Well, certainly Washington, America is behind it, everybody knows. So this case has been, this so-called arbitration tribunal has been seriously tainted and manipulated to some extent, and Washington is behind the same. It's quite obvious. So I think Washington's way to conduct, to handle the issue actually emboldened Philippines embolden Manila to file the case. Otherwise, I don't think they can come to this far. And so it's it's already seriously politicalized rather than purely a legal case. And also, by the way, for example, there is some other elements or factors involved in this kind of a very complicated case. Of course, to some extent, the Philippines have their own rights. They can exercise their own rights according to the UNCLOS to pursue the way. However, Chinese way also must be equally be respected. So that's why I'm trying to argue. But no matter what happened, it will not going to change the fact that the Philippines illegally occupy Chinese territory in the South China Sea.
So, gentlemen, do you think China's dual track proposal will be widely accepted by ASEAN member states, Mr. Rai?
Well, currently it's as I said, we have a successful story, a bilateral story between China and Vietnam back in 2004.
And China and Brunei, you just mentioned.
And China and Brunei, yes, we like to explore the further potential possibility to conduct that because both sides has agreed. So that will be a brilliant start for China and Brunei to proceed any kind of future negotiation and a talk. And then to make it another successful story to demonstrate there is a great value in this dual track.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen, indeed, for your input. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CCTV News. I'm Pan Dong in Beijing. Bye-bye.